From 13 rebellious colonies to a continental superpower in just 78 years. This is the extraordinary story of how America conquered a continent, transformed its economy, and set the stage for the bloodiest war in its history. The United States of America was founded in the 17th and 18th centuries through the rebellion of 13 British colonies in North America against the motherland. Although the beginning of the American War of Independence is tied to the revolutionary and republican ideas of the nation's founding fathers, the establishment of the United States was largely based on economic reasons. As the treasury of the British Empire was exhausted in the 18th century by endless wars against its rival, the Kingdom of France and its allies, the empire had to reflect this burden on its colonies through tax increases and price adjustments. The imperial government had ignored the fact that the 13 colonies in North America had built a social life and institutions largely independent from the motherland over the past 200 years. The long distance between England and the colonies, and the demographic structure of the white immigrant population that formed the colonies. The composition of this population occurred in an interesting way. While many of those who immigrated in the 1600s were of English origin, the wave of immigration in the 1700s consisted predominantly of Scots, Irish, Germans, and French Protestants. Unlike the later colonized Australia and New Zealand, relatively few convicts were transported to the 13 colonies. The composition of the immigrant population consisted predominantly of Protestant workers, farmers, and merchants. This described a community of people who were imbued with the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment and had dared to cross a vast ocean for the struggle to survive. When the demographic structure of a population of approximately 2 million combined with the Republican and liberal ideas of the leaders produced by this population, the American War of Independence became inevitable. Although the British could control the seas as they wished, they did not have the land power to control such a large rebellious population, and the British treasury had not recovered. Moreover, the entry of the empire's ancient rivals, the French and Spanish, into the war with their navies on the side of the rebelling colonies determined the outcome of the war. There is no single leader who founded the United States. The 13 colonies had been born and lived in what was essentially a confederal system from the beginning. For this reason, although the U.S. War of Independence was led by the former British colonel and new American general George Washington, hero of the 7 Years' War, the U.S. was founded and shaped by regional leaders known as the Founding Fathers. The number of Founding Fathers is still debated. It can be claimed that the 56 representatives who signed the Declaration of Independence or the 36 people who signed the Constitution are included among these leaders, but there are 6 people who largely founded and shaped the United States: George Washington, first U.S. President; Thomas Jefferson, third U.S. President; John Adams, second U.S. President; Benjamin Franklin, philosopher, politician, scientist; Alexander Hamilton, first U.S. Treasury Secretary; and James Madison, fourth U.S. President. Although all of the Founding Fathers, 36 or 56 people, were men, it can be said that Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison left their mark on the founding of the U.S. through their influence on their husbands. The founding of the U.S. is based on a chain of compromises and concessions between colonies and politicians. We can see these concessions and compromise system very clearly in American institutions and life today. Because the U.S. was founded as a reaction to the centralized structure of the British Empire, states were defined as political units with broad rights. While the southern colonies and some founding fathers within the 13 colonies wanted the U.S. to be formed as a loose confederation, the northern colonies and a large portion of the founding fathers proposed a federal system with a strong central government. All of the leaders who founded the U.S. were Republican, contrary to the dominant understanding of the time. At the same time, these leaders advocated that the state power of the new American Republic should be divided between the states and Congress, consisting of two separate legislative bodies, and the U.S. president and government. However, the proportion and manner in which this power would be divided was an important subject of debate. Unlike the British tradition of an unwritten constitution, each state had written its own constitution, and at the same time, the constitution of the federal state was also created. The intricate issue of power sharing was initially resolved by adapting a loose federal system through compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, later Confederalists. The issue of power sharing between states and federal governments would essentially be resolved by civil war 85 years later. U.S. independence had an extremely significant economic impact. The mercantilist system, in which the British Empire's price controls and customs system exploited the colonies, disappeared. When the empire's rules and restrictions on trade, settlement, and immigration and production ended, the liberal policies of the new republic accelerated economic growth at a tremendous rate. The 13 states rapidly began to expand their territories westward and establish new settlements. The issue of slavery had been a much debated topic. Although a large portion of the Founding Fathers owned slaves, almost all of them had benefited from the economic environment created by the slavery system. For example, the leader of the War of Independence and first U.S. President George Washington and Founding Fathers Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had hundreds of slaves. Alexander Hamilton had married into a family that owned many slaves. However, all of these leaders agreed that the slavery system, which was contrary to the principles of the American War of Independence, should be abolished after a period. For example, Benjamin Franklin, who previously owned a small number of slaves, would become president of the First Abolition Society in his final years. President George Washington added a clause to his will requesting that his slaves be freed after his death. However, none of the Founding Fathers were as determined about the abolition of slavery as, for example, the anti-slavery intellectuals in England or the Quaker sect, a staunch Protestant movement in the 13 colonies. The federal system and the issue of slavery would be subjects of debate and conflict in the young American Republic for many years. As the U.S. expanded in the 18th century, these debates would deepen and lead to a quite bloody civil war. Even today, we see the deep scars of these two issues in American domestic politics. The birth of the American state was unique, just like the birth of the Roman Republic 2,000 years ago. The Treasury Secretary had started with a strong fiscal policy, creating a central state treasury by exchanging all states' debts with bonds issued by the federal government. To pay this debt, he established a federal customs system, introducing a central import tax system. To satisfy those opposed to the federal system, the Bill of Rights was published, incorporating individual and state rights into the Constitution. The origin of this document is the famous 1689 English Bill of Rights. The two-party system was also established during this period, the ruling Federalist Party and the opposition Republican Democratic Party. The ruling Federalist Party would collapse after the 1812 British-US War. The opposition Republican Democratic Party would later split, and the Democratic and Whig parties would become parts of the two-party system. Later, the Whig Party would weaken, and its void would be filled by the newly established 1854 Republican Party, also known as the Grand Old Party.
The United States was born, fortunately. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte sold the Louisiana Territory, spanning exactly 2.14 million square kilometers, to the Americans in order not to lose it to the British and to somewhat strengthen the French treasury due to the approaching war. In this way, the young U.S. doubled its territory, but more importantly, it gained a valuable trade route on the Mississippi River. Today, there are 15 states in this region between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. The funny part is that this deal, amounting to 15 million American dollars, not today's paper dollars, all backed by gold, was financed by banks with British Baring & Co. Bank leading the syndication. For financing, the Americans issued bonds equal to the purchase amount and financed this purchase with a 15-year term and 6% fixed interest.
Napoleon would also put this money into the budget with which he would finance the Napoleonic Wars. What happened would happen to the Native American population in this region. While the young American Republic was expanding its territories, it was also multiplying its population at an incredible rate. Immigrants settling in vast lands were not only multiplying at an incredible rate, these farmers needed many children for labor. More immigrants were coming to these vast lands every year. Therefore, it can be stated that the country's population doubled every 20-25 years. This tremendous increase can be expressed as follows. While there was only a white population of 250,000 in 1700, by 1800 the white population had exceeded 4 million, and by 1815 it was approaching 7 million. The black slave population was only 20,000 people in 1700. By 1815, this population had reached 1.5 million people, including those born as slaves and those forcibly brought from Africa. This painful human trafficking had reached exactly 10 million people between 1648 and 1815, 1 million to the Middle East, 9 million to North and South America. Those who died during these horrific journeys transported under extremely poor conditions are not included in the figures. In 1807, the British Empire declared slavery illegal. The U.S. banned international slave trade in 1808, but the existing slavery system continued. Slavery in the U.S. would end with its constitutional abolition on December 18, 1865, after the North won the American Civil War. The expansion of the young American state had accelerated the elimination of American natives, who had been systematically destroyed since Columbus. Although the Founding Fathers saw themselves as the most liberal and progressive politicians of the time, their views on American natives were quite harsh. George Washington's order regarding the Iroquois Native Americans who acted with the British, destruction of settlement areas, capture of prisoners of all ages and genders, burning of agricultural areas, etc., falls within the framework defined today as genocide. Or President Andrew Jackson's forced deportation west of the Mississippi River through the presidential decree known as the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was complete ethnic cleansing. What happened after this decision is known as one of the first ethnic cleansing examples of modern history, and the deportation of 18 Native American tribes, most of whom lost their lives during forced migration, is known as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears would show what the fate of American Native Americans would be in the 19th century. Americans would fight the British for the last time between 1812 and 1815. The reason for this war was the British desire to cut off the Americans' highly profitable trade with the French and Spanish during the Napoleonic Wars. Additionally, the border issue between the U.S. and British Canada would fuel the war. The course would be like a yo-yo toy. The Americans would attempt to invade Canada, but the British would bring strong forces after Napoleon's defeat in 1814, capture Washington, and burn the Capitol building and the presidential residence, the White House. However, as the British had no possibility of achieving a definitive victory over the U.S. at this time, peace would be made upon news that Napoleon had returned from his first exile on Elba. This war marks the beginning of Canada forming a separate national identity for the first time. Meanwhile, what happened would again happen to the Native American tribes who were allies of the British. With the Creek War, Native Americans would be forced to leave vast lands, approximately 100,000 square kilometers, in the Alabama and Georgia regions.
Seeing these events and the melting of their empires in Latin America, with Latin American wars of independence, the Spanish would sit down at the table with the Americans. With the Adams-Onis Treaty, today's state of Florida would be sold to the Americans for 5 million Spanish gold coins. The Americans' first challenge to the great European powers would be with the 1823 Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is the first U.S. declaration of "I exist too" in the existing global order. fifth U.S. President James Monroe had announced that he would not accept European colonialism in the New World, that is, in the North and South American continents, or the intervention of European great powers in these regions. At the time of this announcement, Latin America had largely declared or was about to gain its independence from the Spanish. In other words, with the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. was telling the Old World not to interfere in the affairs of the New World. Meanwhile, the issue of slavery was increasingly creating friction between the southern and northern states. Although slavery had been abolished in states north of the Mason-Dixon line, this line is exactly the theoretical division of the northern-southern states. As early as 1804, many issues such as the situation of slaves escaping from the South were controversial. Meanwhile, as the advance of new immigrants westward continued, the real crisis would erupt between the U.S. and Mexico, which had gained its independence from Spain. During this period, Mexico was a quite large country of approximately 4.25 million square kilometers. The vast area formed by the states located in the southernmost and southwestern part of the U.S. today, especially today's California and Texas states, was previously Mexican territory. The crisis between Mexico and the U.S. began when Texas, then called Coahuila y Texas, which legally belonged to Mexico, rebelled by not recognizing the central government and declaring independence. As the number of American immigrants in the region gradually increased, the region also attracted U.S. interest. However, the American government would not want to take action on Texas for 10 years. The reason was quite strange, and at the same time within the logic of the time. If Texas were admitted to the United States, it would be a state where slavery would be free, and the balance of power in the federal government held by the North could change. However, with Mexico's involvement, Mexico and the U.S. would go to war over this region. The war was a disaster for Mexico. The Americans could not hold a candle to the great powers in Europe in military terms, but they managed to completely defeat Mexico in just 21 months and enter the capital, Mexico City. Mexico lost all of Texas, California, Nevada, and Utah, certain parts of today's Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. In return for this Carthaginian peace, the Americans only paid 15 million USD as war reparations and land acquisition fee, and also assumed Mexico's 3.25 million USD debt to U.S. citizens. Mexico lost the equivalent of 2.2 million square kilometers and 55% of its pre-war territories. Gold and oil would be found in these regions in a short time. While American losses were only 13,300 people, they had managed to acquire an area the size of all Western Europe in 21 months between 1846 and 1848. The real struggle over the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the war took place within the U.S. Senate. In the Senate, the Southern states had ensured through voting power that slavery would be allowed in the newly acquired Southern states. The U.S.-Mexico War had greatly inflamed the slavery problem and the North-South division. The states in the southern and western regions that joined the rapidly growing U.S. had made political compromise more difficult. Now the division between Federalists-Confederalists, North-South, and pro-slavery versus anti-slavery advocates would rapidly grow, and all stakes would be shared in the extremely bloody American Civil War, in which the U.S. would be founded for the second time.
There is no historical parallel to the tremendous progress from 1783, when the United States won its War of Independence, to 1861, when the American Civil War began. Since its founding, the U.S. had easily expanded west and south, its rivals being Native American tribes that they easily destroyed or exiled, and in the south, Mexico, which had begun to collapse when it was founded. Even more incredible was that despite receiving such intense integration, the country suffered from labor shortages during the industrialization phase. In the 19th century, despite the recklessly and easily expanding lands attracting more immigrants from Europe, the industrializing northern states had difficulty finding industrial workers to work their share. Until the Civil War, labor wages in the U.S. were 1/3 higher than in Europe. The Industrial Revolution that started in England and spread to Europe would provide the U.S. with more leverage after a certain time interval. The U.S.'s share of world production output in 1800
was only 0.8%. Let us note that this figure for all of Europe in the same year was 28%, and for China, 33%. Before the American Civil War in 1860, the U.S. share had risen to 7%, and we see that it came very close to the United Kingdom's 9.5% share. In 1860, while the share of all of Europe rose to an incredible figure of 53%, China's share had fallen to 19.7%. The fact that India's share was 19.7% in 1800, when it was partially under British control, while it regressed to 8.6% in 1860 when it was a complete British colony, is extremely significant. The U.S. had not only industrialized between 1783 and 1860, but had also used the railroad, one of the most important inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution, as a complete lever. Railroads provided great leverage to connect the rapidly expanding territories of the Americans and to transport the enormous amounts of raw materials to production centers and for sale to Europe. More importantly, with entrepreneurs like Samuel Slater who brought textile and garment production techniques from England to the U.S., American industry had managed to combine the techniques that increased industrial productivity of the great European states with the resources in their continent-sized country. Moreover, cotton, which was among the most important of these raw materials, was produced in the South with slave labor. In the 1850s, 75% of world cotton production was produced in the South. The real industrial breakthrough of the United States would occur during the American Civil War. Against the South's more skillful generals and male population who rode horses and used weapons extremely well, the numerically superior and industrialized North would wage an extraordinarily large struggle. Let us not forget that the total irreversible dead and missing casualties in the American Civil War are greater than the sum of U.S. casualties in World War I and World War II. The war would cause a revolutionary industrial change with its enormous scale. The origin of the interchangeable parts used in many machines today is based on the design of the parts inside the numerous rifled breech-loading rifles used during the American Civil War. Below, you see the status quo before the Civil War began. The states marked in yellow had seceded from the U.S. and established the Confederate States, the South. The states marked in blue represent the industrialized and densely populated states, the North. While the northern states represented the Union, that is, the U.S., the Confederates had seceded from the U.S. and established their own state. The American Civil War can also be defined as the struggle between North-South, Union Confederate states, and anti-slavery states and states where slavery was legal. In just 78 years, America transformed from a collection of rebel colonies into a continental empire. But the contradictions built into its foundation, federalism versus states' rights, free labor versus slavery, were about to explode in the most devastating conflict in American history. The stage was set for a war that would claim more American lives than both world wars combined, and finally answer the question, what kind of nation would America truly be?